And with that, it is my honor to introduce Michelle Melendez, who is the Director of Equity and Inclusion for the inaugural Director of the City of Albuquerque's Office of Equity and Inclusion. She is a Chicana native of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and has more than 18 years of experience in community development, leadership development, and advocacy to address the social determinants of health and their policy antecedents. She holds a master's degree in public administration and a bachelor's degree in communication, and had served as a journalist for 13 years before moving into community health equity work. Michelle has a variety of experience working as the director of El Valle, a South Valley Healthy Communities Collaborative of the Rio Grande Community Development Corp, and as the development director and training director at First Choice Community Healthcare. She also worked as the community services director of Children's Street, St. Joseph's Children, and for New Mexico Department of Health after she left her journalism career. Michelle brings a lifelong vision of racial equity to the Office of Equity and Inclusion and believes that her relationships with incredibly dedicated social justice, economic development, and public health champions will lead the city of Albuquerque to embrace equity as a guiding principle in all areas of civic life. So please join me in welcoming Michelle to our Future of Work series. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you for the invitation and that very kind intro, Erica, and for the inspiration, Sonia, for sharing why we all think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is extremely important in these times. I'll tell you a little bit about the formation of our office. We're a little bit more than 3 years old now. Mayor Tim Keller established this office when he came into office as mayor. And it started as an office of 2. And you know what that's like, to be charged with addressing racism. And you've got 2 of you assigned to that. And so we've always known that this is a capacity building challenge for the city. And we take a technical assistance and capacity building approach to our work. Instead of doing for departments, we do with departments so that they can really believe in and understand equity and inclusion and why diversity is so important to our city. And exactly for the reasons that Sonia described, that our values are that we think that it makes us a stronger city. And in fact, that has been quantified. One of the very first things we did was release an equity profile of Albuquerque in 2018 that showed that our entire city would be 11 billion, $11 billion more productive if we were to close the equity gap. So imagine that. Imagine the change in the outcomes for our city and our community and our families if we can address equity, and especially economic equity, what a difference that would make for our communities. And so our office has grown. We're no longer 2. I've got 9 full-time employees now, and many, many contractors and interns at any given time. I've just notified our administration that when we come back to City Hall, I need more space. I have 7 offices right now, and we've got 9 full-time plus many, many interns and contractors. So I'm negotiating for more space within City Hall, and that's a good thing. We're very much in demand, and I think that we have started to show that the city can't operate without equity and inclusion at the center going forward. And so I think all of us have learned over this past year of the pandemic and the reckoning, the racial reckoning that our entire country is undergoing. What we've learned is that race matters. And we've known that all along, right? With the outcomes being what they are, but it's become even more pronounced and more obvious under the pandemic and the kind of Black Lives Matter movement building that has been building up and really, really came to the forefront in 2020. And so we also have learned that it's possible to really have these conversations at a national level and at our local level that normalize conversations about race and racism, and that talk about structural racism. These things were still taboo 3 years ago when we started this office. And the conversations are still difficult, but they're not taboo anymore. It's very, very normal for us to have conversations within City Hall about race and racism, and not just kind of tiptoeing around and talking about diversity, but really, really talking about structural and institutional racism. And so that's a good place for us to be in this work, because there were times when it was very, very difficult to talk about race and racism as underlying issues that were holding our community back before then. And I also wanted to say that I use she and her pronouns, and that's another thing that we're doing within City Hall, is normalizing the use of our personal pronouns as a way to make it more normal for others to be able to also describe their pronouns and not leave it for anybody to assume anything. And so that's another little, we'll talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion beyond race and ethnicity in terms of gender and other aspects of our identities that we bring to work. I also like to think about how this past year taught us a lot about the future of work, because of how stretched all of us were in becoming more flexible and figuring out how to do things completely differently than we had done in the past. And so I think everything that we've learned in this past year can really be put to our futures in the workplace to make it a better place for all people, including people of color. So now I'll go ahead and share my screen. Are you guys seeing my slides?
You're good.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to tell a little story just to get us started, and that is that women in city government were interviewed recently by one of the local newspapers, and they asked us, you know, what was it like to try to hold down a full-time job while caring for children and maybe others dependent on you, as though this was something new, right? And the only thing new about it, in my perspective, was that we were doing all of this while working from home, and some of us also navigating digital learning for children that we're caring for. And while it's true that many more women were placed in this position than men were, I was tempted to reframe the question, as I often am tempted to reframe it in an equity perspective. And to me, I thought that the real question is, why is it in 2020 that families were still faced with this question of who should stay home with the kids, right, under an emergency? And that the obvious answer was often that it should be mothers, because they earn less, still 80 cents on the dollar compared to men doing the same kind of work. And for families having to do this calculus, it made the most sense for mothers to stay home so that the higher income earner could keep working, right? And that brings up all of the memories and all of the discussion about all of the unpaid labor that women have been racking up for decades. And it forces us to think about those big questions like, what are we doing for a universal basic income? You know, what are we doing to close the gender pay gap that still exists? What are we doing to make our workplaces more family friendly, and to have creative and flexible work arrangements so that we can live our lives and work at the same time without really having to tip the balance to accommodate work more than work accommodating us. So my hat's off to all the mothers and fathers, because in my office, it was fathers who were staying home with their kids. I've had the privilege of working with via Zoom over the past year, and especially those that didn't try to hide their kids from the Zoom camera. One of the women in our office really established early on a norm that I really appreciated. And it was that this is their house. I am not going to force my children to stop talking or to stop walking about when we, the workers, have come into your living rooms and your kitchens and your bedrooms that you've converted into office space sometimes. And so all of these things about the future of work really got me thinking when I got this invitation. And that said, COVID really had a disproportionate impact on women in the labor market. And that cannot be understated, right? So the more things change, the more they actually stay the same. And that's the unfortunate thing, is that we're still talking about the gender pay gap and women dropping out of the labor force. 4 times as many women as men dropped out of the labor force, often because they had to care for children at home, and women of color being the most affected by these changes. And this, as we can imagine, has tremendous impact on their careers in terms of years on the job. When you're applying for that job and they're asking for 5 years or whatever of experience, and you had to sit out a year or longer now, because we're into 13 months now, the impact that has on your career and your current earnings, your future earnings, your retirement security, whether you've been able to pay into retirement, all of this is deeply diminished by these disparities, really. That it's not just the COVID that has caused this, it's also the disparities that pre-existed and became more obvious. So as I think about us trying to build back better, I really push that we focus on equity as one of our guiding principles in terms of how do we go back to normal, right? That we center equity in our plans and in how we allocate resources as a city, especially, and the federal government, so that not just in name, but in our policy and our practice. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how the city is approaching its work with companies who are owned by women and people of color, and how we're approaching our own municipal workforce in terms of our own DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and strategies. And I hope that some of it is translatable to your work and your workplaces and in your businesses or your agencies. And as we know, the basics have not changed. We all have to continue to pay special attention to equal employment opportunity, not only for gender equality, but racial and ethnic non-discrimination and accommodations for people with disabilities, differently abled. That's the law, and we can do better than just not discriminate. And that's how I think of equity, is it's going beyond and making intentional and living our values. And that's for sure a value that we hold in City Hall. And so some of the things that we're doing in City Hall is we're incentivizing equity. And the way this is playing out in terms of companies that wish to do business with the city, in addition to it being illegal to pay men and women differently, what we're doing is we're trying to incentivize companies to close that gender equity gap that may still exist. And so the city of Albuquerque makes available a 5-point preference. So anyone who wants to put in a bid or respond to an RFP for the city can get 5 points on their RFP if they have a 0% equity gap, gender equity gap in pay. And it used to be 10% that you could get the 5% preference, even if you still had a 10% gap. That was when the law was first passed in 2015. And then it moved to 7% gap was allowed in 2017. And now under Mayor Keller, we've closed the gap. So you can get that pay or that preference if you have a 0% gap. And another thing that we're doing in city government is we're now conducting what's called a disparity study to see if companies owned by women and people of color are having the same opportunities to do business with the city as everyone else. And if we find in this study that there exists a disparity, then the city legal and policymakers can make a decision, a policy decision about offering a similar preference like the one we have for pay equity for companies that are owned by women and people of color. And to set that kind of a goal, we have to first establish whether we have an inequity. So one of the things that we had to do as a city to even conduct this study is start to collect data from the companies with whom we do business. So if you've ever tried to do business with the city, you've had to fill out a W-9 form. And our W-9 form from the city is different. We call it a modified W-9, and it asks for your race and ethnicity and gender and LGBTQ status, so that we have a better idea of with whom we are working, with whom are we doing business as a city. And so that's one of the ways that we're operationalizing these discussions about equity. Now, moving towards our own, looking at our own city workforce, the municipal workforce, we're also looking inward. Who do we hire as a city? And this is nothing new, right? When I came into the office, I noticed that the old Office of Human Rights for the city back in the 1970s was conducting workforce utilization studies way back in the 1970s and 80s. Because for a long time, our entire country has really come to appreciate that diversity in the workforce is good for obvious reasons. And, you know, just like Sonia described, you get better outcomes when you have diverse points of view and that different sources of knowledge and perspective that come with having people from different backgrounds in your workforce and on your teams. And this is definitely true of Mayor Keller's administration. So it's one of the most diverse at the top and throughout that we've ever seen in the city. And we analyze our workforce, and I'll go through some of how we do that in the next few slides. But just to give you an idea of what the difference is like culturally, I'll never forget the very first directors meeting that I attended. It was at a table similar to this one. There was an inner circle where the chairs are at the table, and then there was another set of chairs against the wall on either side of the table. And, you know, I showed up to my first directors meeting on time, probably a little bit early. And for whatever reason, just having been conditioned in this way over years, I sat at the outer circle, not at the table. And I didn't notice it at the time, but when the mayor and Sarita Nair, the city's first female chief administrative officer and a woman of color, they both looked at the table and they noticed that it was mostly men in suits. And I can't remember if they were mostly people of color or not, because it's a pretty diverse group. But Sarita and the mayor both said, "Can we please integrate this table?" And that sent the message to all of us. So men actually stood up from the table, stepped back, and made room for women to come and sit at the table. And they didn't ever have to tell us that again. You know, you can imagine that every single time we came into that directors meeting again, women sat at the table, not at the exclusion of men, but, you know, the conditioning, that's all it took to condition us differently from that moment on, to know that this was going to be a different workplace where our voices would be very well appreciated. And in addition to looking at our own workforce, we're also looking at how do people with lived experience get that shot for a city job, right? How do we value people from many different backgrounds to get that city job? And my daughter, I'd like to tell a story about how her lived experience has really served her new role very well. It's not quite new anymore, but 3 years ago, she had graduated from college here at UNM with her communications degree, and she was applying for her first big job in communications. And she was really hesitant and afraid to describe on her application and in her interview that she had been a server for 4 years while in college. And she hadn't gotten very much experience in communications per se. But the job she got was a policy job. She was doing communications for a policy advocacy group. And on one of the drives up to Santa Fe for the state legislature, the lawyers that she was working with who had drafted legislation on paid sick leave and on the minimum wage, they were just astounded at her living experience being a server for 4 years, on how tips work, how the minimum wage works in real life, and what the lack of paid sick leave does to a person who doesn't have those benefits. And they told her that they had wished that they had spoken to people with that lived experience before they had written the proposals that they were proposing at the state legislature. And so that really reaffirms for me the value of bringing in people that help you take your theoretical understanding of things from studying and from analyzing and pairing it with practical knowledge of people who have lived it. And I'm sure there are many, many more examples. We've got some in City Hall where that kind of diversity is valued. One that I can think of is we have recently hired the city's or UNM's first DACA attorneys. So this is an attorney who herself has DACA status. And that's deferred action on childhood arrivals. That's an immigration status. And she can give insights to policies that nobody else can. And it's because of her unique experience having to fill out forms like an I-9 form at work and being asked for different kinds of ID and verification of whether she's legally allowed to work, and the signals that certain questions give people that tell you whether or not immigrants should apply, right? So having that kind of benefit of having those perspectives is hugely important to our city, and can also give you some insights into what you would bring with your full lived experience. People with who are speakers of other languages and what they bring to the workplace. People who use wheelchairs and what they have taught us. People who are deaf or hard of hearing and what they've taught me in terms of communication. How do we do our tweets and Facebook and our website to make it fully accessible to people from all these backgrounds? And although I could be told over and over again to make my communication more accessible, it's when somebody is side by side with me, helping me understand the impact of not having that, that it has really, really gelled and made me understand why the need for that kind of communication and inclusion. I'm gonna take a little sip because I've got allergies and my throat gets very, very dry. The problem with webinars is it is very hard to tell if the audience is staying with us, and I will look at the chat once in a while just to see if questions are coming in. Now I wanted to give you a little sense of how we are looking at the city at our own workforce. And so what we've done is we've analyzed our city workforce demographics. That's race, ethnicity, and gender, and compared it with the population of Albuquerque. This slide is a couple of years old. We've done this every year since Mayor Keller took office. And what we have found overall is that the city workforce is slightly more diverse than the population in the city as a whole, right? So the employees, we've got 63% of employees who identify as people of color. Hispanic, Black, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander. And then the other percentage is people who identify as white. And this is slightly more diverse than the community, where in 2018, 59% of the population identified as people of color. And what we found when we really delved in below the surface was that this better representation in the city of Albuquerque employee is really driven by Hispanic. So Hispanics are doing pretty well in terms of getting jobs with city government. But when we look at where in the city and where they fall on the pay scales, then it's very much at the lower levels, right? And you might find this about your own institution as well, is it's at the solid waste department, it's in clerical, it's in front desk kinds of jobs where there's a predominance of women of color in the clerical and men of color in the blue collar work and that sort of thing. And then there's gender inequities. And some of those are a little bit structural and have been for a long time in terms of like firefighters, very, very dominated by men, right? But so when we look at this data, we see opportunities. We see the opportunities to recruit from a very, very diverse pool that is the population of Albuquerque. And so that's how we set a goal to make our own city workforce much more reflective of our city as a whole and the population as a whole. And so first we had to look at how are we collecting the data? And I learned something new at the city, and that was that it was optional. So new employees are asked to describe their own ethnicity and race. And if they leave that blank, then HR was in a position of guessing, right? And we know how bad that can go if you guess somebody's race, especially with so many mixed race people and mixed ethnicities, you're not likely to get a very good set of data. And so we wanted to change that so that visual identification is what it was called, would no longer be the norm. And one of the ways of changing that was to tell people when that question comes up, if you choose not to answer, then HR will be forced to guess. And I think it says it differently than that, but for EEO purposes, the city has to report what the racial makeup is of our workforce, but the question was optional. So that was one data challenge. The other is in terms of gathering data on gender. So it was during this past 3 years that state law changed that allows people who are transgender to change their birth certificates and their driver's licenses subsequently to match the gender identity. And this means that the city needed to add a non-binary choice to the drop-down menu, because we were asking people and it was a forced choice between male and female. And if you were neither of those genders, then there was no option for you. So we're working on that. I think it's been fixed, but it's always a question of, which platform are we using? And we were using NeoGov, and we're having to retool some of those software programs so that we can ask the questions that we need to. And when we're looking at our city workforce, there are a few different ways nationally that are best practices that we can measure equity. And the way we are approaching it is the idea, the goal is the representation, right? We want our city workforce to be representative of our community as a whole. And so the ways to move that needle can happen at the attraction side. What are we doing to recruit? And you can even go further, not just the recruitment, but the pipeline. How are we working with partners like CNM to really get people into the pipeline for the jobs that we have to fill? And then there's the opportunity at the selection phase. What are we doing to give people equal opportunity for the job itself? And we'll go into some more discussion of why that's such an important phase to pay attention to. And then what are you doing to retain employees of color and help them move up the career ladder, right? So that we can change that dynamic that showed us that people of color, especially Hispanics, were tending to stay at the entry level and the lower pay scales. And so these are some of the major ways that the city of Albuquerque is looking at the municipal workforce in a very detailed manner. And I work very closely with our Department of Human Resources. So I don't do this work by myself. It's always in collaboration. It's in that technical advice, technical capacity building feature that we do. So when we think about that first pillar, we think about how do we create opportunities for people of color to have early work experiences. One of the hidden secrets that I learned when I came to City Hall was that every year the city hires more than 1,000 young people to work for the community centers and parks and rec and the swimming pools and all these cool jobs for the summer. And many of my colleagues in city government, especially the ones that have been here for 20 some years, they often got their first jobs in that summer rec program. And then they stayed with the city forever after. And often they were the ones who were getting their children those jobs every year. And so the first year I came to the city, I got my job in March of 2018. And I learned that the city was already almost finished hiring for the summer. So the hiring for the summer jobs starts in February. And so it was almost too late to change anything about how you get that job with the city. So over the past 2 years, we've really mixed that up so that now we have job fairs and we do heavy recruiting in communities of color so that many more people, including those who don't have family already working for the city, get those job opportunities. And so that's just one way that we have tried to diversify our own city employment. Another is that our city was one of the first in the state to ban the box. And this was meaning that we don't ask at the very earliest stage whether people have a criminal background. We do ask that for safety sensitive positions later on in the process of hiring. But in order to not screen people out at the very earliest stage, we don't ask that question at the very beginning of the application period. And this is a key tenet of a policy that's known nationally as the fair chance hiring policy. And that's where cities and like the entire state of California has mandated that employers, including private employers, not ask employees or applicants about their conviction history until later in the process, so that people who have been incarcerated or who have some kind of a criminal history in their background can have a fair chance at getting a job. And that's really important in our city and state, given the high rate of people of color who have been overly represented in incarceration. Now, in addition to kind of the what we do, it's also how we do it. So we have been doing much more proactive recruitment, and we started having career fairs. Believe it or not, the city had not had career fairs that we knew of for a very long time. And then we went a step further and had what we called quick hiring events. And that was almost on the spot hiring, and even went a few steps further than that. And so people who had applied for one job and weren't the right fit were also being considered for other jobs for which they might be qualified. And then we were proactively calling those people and saying, hey, we know you applied for this job and you didn't get it, but we really think you should look at this other job because we think you'd be a good fit. So that's some real proactive recruitment out there that helps get that diverse applicant into your applicant pool. Plus doing the things that diversity offices have done forever, which is helping our departments figure out where to recruit from and giving them lists of places where they could recruit from. I'm watching the time. I know I'm going a little over, so I'll speed through a few of these. We're almost done.
You're
The
good,
other
Michelle.
things that we find important are having hiring committees that are diverse themselves, so that you kind of control for what could be implicit bias. So if you have a committee that's doing the interviews that is not diverse, then people tend to gravitate towards people that are like them. And so what we've tried to do is let's have more diverse hiring committees. And what we're working on is having an accountability system that really holds directors and hiring managers accountable for implementing some of these more proactive strategies. And then what kinds of benefits does your employer offer? So having paid parental leave, it's not just good for people of color and women, but this is good for same-sex couples that are adopting, right? Or others. So things like that that make a difference in terms of the kind of employer that you want to be. Our city is very, very proud of offering transgender inclusive benefits, including health benefits. And we've gotten pretty good ratings on a national report card for being very LGBTQ friendly. And part of that is by including the benefits that we need. And that's when I was talking to you a little bit earlier about the state law changed. And so each of your companies, businesses, and agencies is also going to have to think about how are you taking non-gender, or excuse me, gender neutral options into account when you are categorizing employees. So we've talked about kind of the recruitment, we've talked a little bit about advancement, and we've got some professional development strategies that we're using to help people move up the career ladder, including a pre-management development program and supervisor training, so that people who came in as entry level can really start to move up the career ladder. And that's that retention strategy. And then when people do leave, really trying to understand what happened, why are they leaving, what's going on in the workplace or in the community that is a driver of this kind of separation, so that we can try to address that. So taken all together, these strategies, we think are beginning to make a difference for the city. It's very slight. You know, we had a hiring freeze, and we're still technically in a hiring freeze right now. So we haven't had a huge change in terms of our makeup, diversity makeup of our city employees, but it's moving in the right direction. And so a continued focus on this, we think, will lead to even better representation going forward. And so, and we really try to involve our community itself, stakeholders, by having focus groups and roundtable discussions, so that we can hold ourselves accountable and make this kind of data very open and transparent, so that we can get to the changes that we want to see as a city. And that is the conclusion of the presentation, and I'd be happy to take some questions.
Okay, Michelle, we have someone that is wondering what your office may be doing to combat racism in APD. They comment many officers have recently resigned due to current policies for protests.
I can speak a little bit to that, but we have not taken on the challenge of trying to address racism in APD by ourselves. So what we have done is work with the chiefs and with the academy to start to present them with some good training resources. So some really basic cultural competency, cultural humility training. And what we do is our office recruits community organizations with whom we have a really close relationship and bring them into the training academy to provide training on Islamophobia, Native American culture, and people living in Albuquerque, urban Indians, Asian American and Pacific Islander culture and experiences living in Albuquerque. LGBTQ, we have a transgender 101 training for cadets and things like that. And the history of Black Americans in Albuquerque and their experience with police. And so, but we know that training by itself doesn't do everything that we want to do to reform a police department, especially in the national context. And so we have supported APD's efforts to really think through how does it want to change the culture of APD. And so I'll address the question of the officers who resigned from that team. And the way I understand it is they were standing in solidarity with a lieutenant or a sergeant who had disobeyed an order. So an order had gone out in terms of what one of those people on the scene should do during a white pride rally. And when that person disobeyed an order, he was reprimanded and his fellow officers resigned in protest because of that person being reprimanded. So from my perspective, the chief is holding accountable officers for doing what our values say as an institution, which is allowing people to exercise their freedom of speech and not putting the community in danger. And so I don't know all the details of it, but I support the chief holding accountable officers for their actions in the field.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. You know, I want to say that, and there was some chat there that we got privately as well as that went out to everyone, that people really appreciated a lot of the specific examples you gave around, you know, some of the strategies that the city is implementing. As you're having an opportunity, there's different people listening in that represent different organizations at different places on the journey. What's your recommendation on, you know, is there a strategy or a particular approach that you're like, if you're going to do anything, we really believe that this has helped us transform our culture?
Well, we have an entire initiative that is focused on culture change. And we've got probably 22 different kinds of webinars that are in our curriculum. And they range from like what we call racial equity 101, which is definitions, you know, the difference between equity and equality. And it's really trying to start where people are at. And then there's many things in between. It's not that it's a structured curriculum with prerequisites, but it is a little bit of scaffolding. And then it goes all the way to very, very intensive anti-racism training and organizing. And the organizing piece is when you've inspired people and then they want to do something with their newfound knowledge, how do you help channel that energy and support those people in their work? Because to be the one in your department who's trying to undo racism, you get crushed. And so we're at the very beginning stages of trying to create some affinity groups so that people who are working on this can feel supported and have a place to come to, even virtually in City Hall, to talk through what it's been like for them to have challenging conversations or to try to bring equity into the conversation in their own departments. And so, you know, we're on this journey. We haven't figured it all out, but we belong to a national network called GARE, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And that brings us into a community of practice. So there are cities all across the country who are doing this at different levels. And we really benefit from being in community with them as well, so that we ourselves can debrief and think about, you know, what's going well and what's not going so well, and what does the road look like, especially from the vantage point of people who are a little further along, or we think they're further along. So, you know, I guess that's my response. I'm not sure if that's answers the question, but that's where we're at.
That's great. And that seems like a theme that, you know, even in response to the other question, as well as some of the other examples that you were saying, is developing, is learning from other community organizations and being in partnership, right, with those organizations. So for all of us to kind of look around and see what is it, maybe, you know, I love the example of looking when you were saying that people were in the exit interview, looking at what your competitors are doing, and maybe your competitors are your community of practice, right? In some ways, that's where you can learn from others. So,
Yeah.
We have a couple of lightning round questions that we like to ask our speakers related to our topic of future of work, as well as what we're all experiencing in this accelerated change environment. So the first question I have for you is, what have you learned from your experiences living through the pandemic, personally or professionally, that will shape how you lead your organization?
Thank you for that question. What I reflected on was that you learn a lot about your strengths and your weaknesses. And I want to attend the next Future of Work series because the collaboration virtually has been a real challenge for me. I'm the type who's very, you know, I got the whiteboard and we're in the room together and we're just brainstorming, and it's been hard. Even though I've learned to use whiteboard on Zoom, it's not the same. And I really, really miss having people together. So the other is taking care of ourselves, especially in this work. My entire team is suffering from what we call racial battle fatigue. Like, we have to think and work on racial equity all day, every day. And it's tiring. And although the whole rest of the world has kind of woken up to this, you know, we signed up for this. So in some ways, you know, that's what we signed up for. But it is very tiring, and how to pay more attention to self-care during this time, and really appreciating that people need some downtime and time away from racial equity work.
Great. And what's one future of work trend that you are watching closely, and why?
It's being flexible in terms of people working from different places. So, and so I've got one of my employees who is going to be working from Gallup, and it's like, why not? You're working from your home. It's really no difference right now. So why not work from Gallup? And taking care of people at home. You know, we've got all kinds of people taking care of their kids and others, elders, parents sometimes. And the idea of micromanaging, I've never been a micromanager, but some people are very, you know, they're very cautious, saying, well, how do we know they're going to be working and not taking? And it's like, well, how do I know that you're not feeding your child right now? Like, what difference does it make? Like, the body of work will show itself.
Yeah.
And we should trust our employees
Great.
more and not try to micromanage their time.
Michelle, I can't thank you enough for giving us your time today, sharing your experience and what you've learned with us, and for all of you that are there, that have attended today. We invite you to attend our next, as Michelle referenced, our next Future of Work lunch topic is on effective remote collaboration. We're actually going to be hearing from a company that went remote before COVID hit. And so we'll be learning from what they've learned in that journey on May 28th. You can register on our website. And thank you again to Sonia and Diane for a beautiful introduction, and Michelle from the city of Albuquerque and the city of Albuquerque itself for all of the work that they are doing in equity and diversity. Thank you to all of our attendees, and have a fabulous Friday.
Thank you.